Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about ecocriticism. Now, in terms of literary studies, ecocriticism is a relative newcomer on the scene, really having sort of blossomed in, I think, the 1990s primarily is when ecocriticism really picks up as a literary discipline. It comes out of the green movement, ecology, biology, oceanography, etc., these different environmental science disciplines and things like this. But in terms of making the transition to a literary discipline, its roots are earlier than the 90s, but I feel like in the 90s, with the upsurge of interest in the environmental movement, was really when ecocriticism started to become an increasingly big deal in literary departments and things like this. So basically, the concern of ecocriticism is the two main concerns of ecocriticism. One is how nature and the natural world are depicted in literature, film, etc., and the other is how authors, filmmakers, artists, etc., try to understand the human experience through the medium of the natural world. So there's a lot of different approaches, a lot of different ways that this works. One of the earliest ways that ecocriticism tended to run was very much a humanist focus. That is a focus on how authors, particularly authors, because it was literary studies primarily early on, how authors used natural imagery, natural settings, depictions of the natural world, etc., in order to make meaning for humans. So how do we figure things out for ourselves, figure out who we are and our own experiences through the medium of natural imagery? So the Romantic poets were a big focus for a lot of the early eco-critics. Byron, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, people like this, because they used a lot of nature imagery. I wandered lonely as a cloud, all of these poems about flowers, poems about the ocean, all of these things that deal with natural imagery in order to understand the human experience. So that was one big early focus of literary ecocriticism. Shakespeare was really the other big one early on, and actually is still a massive one. There's a huge industry of eco-critics who work on Shakespeare. I've actually published an essay myself on Shakespearean eco-criticism. But that's one component of it, is that idea of through natural imagery, through metaphors, through considerations of flowers, of landscapes, of whatever it is, we get insight into what it means to be human. But there's another strand of eco-criticism, another major strand of eco-criticism, that is, that focuses not so much on the human. This might be a post-human or a transhuman approach to eco-criticism. And the interest here is really in nature in itself, or nature depicted in itself within art. So still human-created texts, poems, short stories, plays, films, paintings, whatever it is. But the interest is not in what does this mean for humanity, but what does this mean for the natural world at large. And a lot of this is actually rooted in two major premises. One is that humans are not the center of the universe. The human experience is not the main thing that exists in the universe and has value. So this idea that things other than human beings and human experience have value and are worthy of consideration, that's fundamental to this branch of eco-criticism. But we've also got what the theorist Bruno Latour calls actor network theory. And this can apply to humans as well, but it exceeds just the limits of humanity. Basically, Latour argues that we should see everything that exists as actors within networks of actions. So let me give you an example of this. Imagine the Pacific Ocean, middle of the Pacific Ocean. An underwater volcano erupts. Lava, lava, lava. Over thousands of years, millions of years, maybe. I don't know how long it takes. I don't know anything about geology. But over, let's call it thousands of years, an island forms. Aha! And now you have an island of volcanic rock, volcanic soil. It's nutrient rich because it's come up from the inner earth where all the nutrients are stored, maybe. Then you have a group of birds flying over the Pacific. They're going from one island to another, and they spot a new island. So they land on it. And they poop, because they're birds. Birds poop, as do most things that are alive. So in their poop is various seeds, because birds eat seeds. Those seeds, between the nutrients of the bird poop and the nutrients of the volcanic soil, those seeds start to grow. They grow, they grow. You have plants now, which means that the next time birds stop there, they have food. There's something for them to eat. Maybe you get pollinators that fly and stop on this new island. Insects, bees, whatever it is. You suddenly have a new island. And what Latour would say, I think, as I understand Latour, is that within the creation of that new island, you want to understand the pollinators as actors. They're doing the pollination, obviously. You want to understand the birds as actors, both eating the plants that are growing on this island, but also putting the seeds onto the island in the first place, as well as creating natural fertilizer. You want to understand the volcano as an actor in providing the ground for this. You want to understand even the island, the emerging island itself, as an actor in that it provides a landing place for this flock of birds. And so, without intending to create an island, this is non-teleological in the sense that the volcano, the soil, the birds, the pollinators, none of these things set out with the goal of creating an island, but because of their actions, they're all networked, they're all connected to one another, they create a tangible result. So this is a newer approach to eco-criticism. I think this idea that we can look at depictions of the natural world, we can understand literary depictions, artistic depictions of things in nature without necessarily centering the human experience. There are a couple of other variations with eco-criticism, or broad strands of eco-criticism that I think are worth mentioning. One, my personal favorite, is blue ecology. Traditionally, the early eco-critics, going back basically as long as people have been writing critically about nature imagery in literature, have primarily focused on green ecology or terrestrial ecology, that is, stuff that's on land. So, again, a lot of this connects to romantic poetry and that sort of origin point for a lot of eco-critics. Flowers, meadows, clouds, stuff that's land-based. There's also a strand of blue ecology, which is ocean or water-based. And that's actually my essay on Shakespeare's Pericles is blue eco-criticism. It is about the way that the oceans and ocean life, the distinctive motions of currents, tides, etc., shapes the experience of that play. And actually, the other element in there, this is an idea. So I'll come back to this. I'll come back to transcorporeality in just a second. But one of the things that's distinctive about blue eco-criticism is it tends to emphasize flux much more. It tends to emphasize fluidity, because the oceans, lakes, rivers are watery mediums, whereas the land tends to be associated with much more solidity and stability. And so oceanic eco-critics tend to be much more interested in change, whereas terrestrial or green eco-critics are sometimes more interested in sort of regularity, stability, but also cycles, because you have things like growing cycles, it's the cycles of the seasons, etc. One of the things that, one idea that I do want to talk about with eco-criticism is transcorporeality. This is connected to the humanist branch of eco-criticism because it's about the human experience primarily, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. But transcorporeality is the idea that when our bodies encounter other things, other forces, particularly when we eat, when we drink, but also even when we're just in immersive environments, like when we're in the ocean or something like this, when we're in the forest, that our bodies are actually changed in some ways by that experience. And I think eating is the most overt way to understand this. If I eat sea fish, if I eat an ocean fish, I'm taking that oceanic creature into my own body, and as I digest it, as I break down the various nutrients and whatnot in it, and those are dispersed through my body by my bloodstream, who I am and what I am physically is kind of transfigured by that. I undergo some sort of change that makes me more oceanic. And so this is an interesting idea in eco-criticism. To me, I think of that really in the context of blue ecology much more than green ecology, but I think that's probably an unfair connection just because transcorporeality was central to my paper about blue ecology. But that idea of
what does it mean for human beings to encounter the natural world, is really central to eco-criticism. And the last thing I want to talk about with eco-criticism is what's called dark ecology. Dark ecology is disaster-focused. Not necessarily in the sense of like a comet hitting the Earth or whatever it is, but dark ecology is often much more concerned with issues of sustainability and our general failures to be sustainable as a species, particularly in the US. But it's also concerned with various practices, various elements that are destructive to nature or to the earth. So strip mining or mountaintop removal mining is a big thing in West Virginia, where I got my bachelor's and my doctorate. That's an incredibly destructive process. In Pennsylvania, where I live now, there's been a lot of fracking, and actually that's destroyed the bedrock in large swaths of the state. There are now earthquakes in Pennsylvania where there did not used to be, because that bedrock has been destroyed by fracking. And so these things are detrimental in many ways to the environment. And so these are the kinds of things that dark ecology tends to look at. In my paper, I looked at the prevalence of microplastics in the ocean and how almost every fish that's caught nowadays, almost every sea creature that's caught nowadays has plastic in its stomach. So this is the other element with eco-criticism, is it's not just how do we make sense of nature and how do we understand how nature impacts humanity, but also there's a strand that says how do we impact nature? How do we impact the environment? And unfortunately, the answer to that is often a negative one. But that's eco-criticism. The big contribution of eco-criticism to the broader study of literature is, I would say twofold in terms of major things that it contributes. One is just a more developed, often science-based approach to understanding natural imagery and things like this, because a lot of eco-critics do come out of traditions of environmental science, ecology, biology, etc., oceanography, etc. And so they bring that knowledge to eco-criticism, to literary studies. But then the other thing is an expansion beyond just the concerns of the human, because much literary study across almost all of the schools of literary thought is really focused on the human experience and what it means to be human in the world. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. English is part of the humanities. Literary studies is part of the humanities. But eco-criticism asks us to think bigger, to think beyond just humanity.